My name is Patty Wheeler, and I am 28 years old. For as long as I can remember, love in my family was never evenly distributed. It flowed in one clear direction, always toward my older sister, and whatever little remained never quite reached me. Vicky was the child my parents had planned for, waited for, prepared their lives around. While I arrived barely 10 months later as an accident, they never quite learned how to accommodate. No one ever said it out loud, but children don't need words when silence does the explaining for them. I learned very early how to stay out of the way, how to shrink myself so I wouldn't inconvenience anyone, how to accept scraps of attention and pretend they were enough. My mother's parents passed away before I was born, but my father's parents were very much alive, and in many ways, they became my real parents. When my mother and father needed a break, needed peace, needed time to focus on Vicky, they sent me to my grandparents' house without a second thought. At first, when I was very young, it felt like an adventure. Grandma would bake with me in the afternoons. Grandpa would let me sit beside him while he read the newspaper explaining words I didn't understand. Their home felt warm in a way my parents never did. It took years before I realized that those visits weren't temporary escapes, they were quiet rejections. By the time I was 6 or 7, I noticed patterns children aren't supposed to notice. Family trips where Vicky packed her bags and I packed mine for Grandma's house. School events where my parents cheered loudest for her accomplishments and clapped politely for mine. If I ever asked why I couldn't come along, my mother would smile tightly and say it was just easier this way while my father avoided my eyes altogether. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was lucky to have grandparents who loved me. What I didn't realize then was that I was learning how to accept being second place as my permanent role. My problem wasn't only my parents, it was Vicky too. I didn't hate her. I wanted to make that clear even now. But she knew exactly where she stood in our family, and she wielded that knowledge like a quiet weapon. Everything between us was a competition she was determined to win: grades, attention, praise, even sympathy. If I did well on a test, she needed to do better. If my parents noticed me for a moment, she found a way to reclaim the spotlight. She never had to try very hard. My parents always chose her side. Middle school was when things turned sharper. Vicky didn't have many friends, and I think that insecurity followed her everywhere. One year I became friends with a group of girls from my art class. They were kind, creative, and for the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere. When Vicky found out, she panicked. She begged me to introduce her to them, and when I hesitated, knowing how socially awkward she could be, she ran straight to our parents. Suddenly I was selfish. Suddenly I was cruel for not wanting to include my own sister. My father told me it was my responsibility to look after her. My mother said family always came first. So I gave in. I brought Vicky along, and from the moment she joined us, the atmosphere changed. She tried too hard, spoke too loudly, crossed boundaries without noticing. One afternoon, she embarrassed one of the girls by telling a boy about her crush without permission. The boy laughed, told others, and the girl cried in the bathroom while the rest of us stood there stunned. After that, the girls pulled me aside and asked me gently, apologetically, not to bring Vicky anymore. I agreed, and for once I chose myself. Vicky exploded when she found out. She accused me of betraying her, of choosing mean girls over my own sister. My parents, as always, sided with her. They told me to fix it, to make the girls forgive her, and if they refused, I should stop seeing them too. That was the first time I said no. I told them I wasn't responsible for Vicky's friendships, and I wasn't going to give up mine. The silence that followed lasted weeks. They barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was cold and clipped. But despite the guilt gnawing at me, I held firm. Those girls became my sisters in every way that mattered. We grew up together, cried together, celebrated together. Even then, though, I sensed that standing my ground had cost me something I would never get back. And that was only the beginning of how far Vicky was willing to go when she felt threatened. Vicky's resentment didn't fade with time, it fermented. The older we got, the more she seemed convinced that everything good in my life existed only to mock what she lacked. By high school, that belief had hardened into something sharp and ugly, something that needed an outlet. I learned to recognize the warning signs, the way she watched me when I laughed too freely, the way her voice tightened. Whenever my name came up at the dinner table, the way she kept mental tallies of perceived slights I didn't even know I'd committed. If I had a good day, she made sure it ended badly. The next major fracture came because of a boy, or rather because of what Vicky decided a boy represented. He was a classmate, someone I sat next to during lectures, someone who joked with me about assignments and shared notes when one of us was absent. I didn't know, no one told me that Vicky had built an entire fantasy around him in her head. When he asked me to junior prom, I declined without hesitation. I already had plans with someone else, someone I actually liked. To me, it was a non-event. To Vicky, it was proof that I was stealing from her again. She screamed. She cried. She told my parents I'd been flirting with him for months, that I knew she liked him and didn't care that I enjoyed humiliating her. She called me names I still flinch remembering. My mother listened to her sobs and nodded along, telling me I should have respected girl code, that sisters don't do this to each other. I tried to explain that I hadn't even known Vicky liked him, that I had turned him down, but explanations were useless when my parents had already chosen a version of the story that painted me as the villain. Looking back, I think Vicky knew the truth. I think she knew he would never have asked her. And instead of sitting with that pain, she redirected it at me. Not long after that, my father surprised me by asking if I wanted to go out for ice cream, just the two of us. It felt surreal. He never did things like that. I remember sitting across from him feeling cautiously hopeful, like maybe this was the moment things changed. But his questions weren't about me. They were about my boyfriend, about drugs, alcohol, sex, whether I was being careful. The words felt rehearsed, clinical, nothing like concern, and everything like suspicion. That was when he told me Vicky had been feeding them stories for months, telling them I was partying, using substances, hiding dangerous behavior. I felt something inside me crack. I handed him my phone, showed him messages, photos, anything that proved she was lying. When he confronted her, she didn't apologize. She doubled down. She said girls my age didn't just hang out with boys, that I was hiding something, that she was only trying to protect me. I lost control. I told her she needed to stop obsessing over my life, that it wasn't my fault she had no one to date, and that she didn't get to destroy my reputation because she was insecure. The room went silent. And then without warning, she punched me. I remember the sound before the pain. A dull crack, then warmth on my face. I hit the floor hard, my vision blurring, as blood spilled down my nose. My parents rushed me to the emergency room, begging me the entire way not to involve the police, not to ruin Vicky's future. She sat in the back seat, arms crossed, staring out the window like none of it concerned her. When the nurse asked what happened, I told the truth. And the truth triggered consequences my parents never expected. Child Protective Services was called. Suddenly, what they wanted buried was under fluorescent lights and official paperwork. My parents were furious not at Vicky, but at me. They pleaded with the authorities, insisting it was an accident, a misunderstanding, something that would never happen again. Vicky was warned. My parents were warned. And when it was over, they told me they were disappointed in me. My mother cried, accusing me of tearing the family apart. My father said I'd gone too far. I listened quietly numb and then told them I wanted Vicky out of my life. For the first time, they agreed. I felt guilty. I also felt safe. Vicky stopped speaking to me entirely after that, and I preferred the silence. When my grandparents heard what happened, they told me to pack my bags. I moved in with them shortly after, and my parents didn't try to stop me. That was the moment I stopped hoping they ever would. Living with my grandparents felt like stepping into a different world, one where I didn't have to constantly brace myself for emotional whiplash. Their house was quiet in a comforting way, filled with routines that made me feel anchored rather than controlled. My grandmother insisted on eating dinner together every night, even when schedules clashed. My grandfather asked about my day and actually listened to the answer. No one compared me to anyone else. No one treated my achievements like inconveniences. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. High school finished gently. I thrived academically, strengthened the friendships that had already become lifelines, and learned what it felt like to exist without constant tension buzzing under my skin. My parents never called. They never visited. I told myself it didn't matter, but there were nights when I stared at my phone, wondering how easy it was for them to forget I existed. When graduation came, they showed up only long enough to cheer loudly for Vicky. They didn't hug me. They didn't congratulate me. It was my grandparents who stood clapping until their hands hurt. Later, my grandfather confronted my parents. I don't know what he said, but afterward, my father approached me awkwardly and offered a stiff congratulations. It felt performative, something done out of obligation rather than pride. I thanked him anyway. Old habits die hard. The real turning point came when I found out I'd received a full scholarship to college. Relief flooded me. First relief that I wouldn't have to ask my parents for anything. Relief that my future didn't depend on their generosity. My grandparents took me out to celebrate, and my grandmother posted about it online, gushing in a way only proud grandparents can. The congratulations poured in. That was how my parents found out. My mother called the next day not to celebrate but to scold. She said Vicky was devastated, locked in her room crying because she hadn't been accepted anywhere yet. She accused me of flaunting my success, of deliberately hurting my sister. She even blamed me for Vicky's grades, claiming I'd pushed her into depression after the CPS incident. Something inside me went very still. I realized then that nothing I did would ever be right. That was the last conversation I had with my mother for years. College was freedom. I moved into my dorm with my grandparents by my side, carrying boxes and quiet encouragement. My high school boyfriend and I broke up because of distance, and while it hurt, it also felt like a clean slate. I threw myself into studying, into building a life that belonged solely to me. That's when I met Rob. He was quiet, thoughtful, always buried in a book. We became study partners, then friends, then something more. I was the one who admitted my feelings first, and to my surprise, he felt the same. Our relationship grew slowly, steadily, without drama or manipulation. His parents welcomed me like family, and his mother once confessed she'd always wanted a daughter. I cried in the car afterward, overwhelmed by how easily they gave me what I'd spent my whole life craving. 8 years passed. My parents sent the occasional birthday text. Nothing more. When Rob proposed nervous, earnest, breathtakingly sincere, I said yes without hesitation. I told my grandparents first. They cried. I posted online, and somehow the news found its way back to my parents. Their call felt strange, like hearing from ghosts. They asked about my job, my apartment. Then my father asked if he could walk me down the aisle. The question stunned me. He didn't even know where I worked. I hesitated, torn between hope and fear. Against my better judgment, I said yes. I wanted to believe this was the beginning of something better. The illusion that my parents had changed didn't last long. It rarely ever does when it's built on nothing but wishful thinking. At first, the wedding planning distracted me from everything else. My high school friends, my real sisters, in all the ways that mattered, agreed to be my bridesmaids without hesitation. We cried over video calls, reminisced about cramped bedrooms and late-night confessions, and planned a bachelorette trip that felt like a reward for surviving our younger years. For a little while, I let myself believe this chapter could exist without the shadows of the past reaching into it. Then my parents called again. They were upset that I hadn't invited Vicky to the bachelorette party. The disappointment in their voices carried the familiar edge of accusation, as if I'd committed some unspoken crime. I told them calmly that Vicky wasn't part of my life and that she wouldn't be part of my wedding either. The line went silent for a moment, the way it always did right before things turned ugly. My mother spoke first. She said I was being cruel. My father followed, insisting it was my duty as a sister to include her. They claimed Vicky was excited to reconnect now that I was getting married, as if time and accountability were optional details. I asked why she hadn't apologized in all these years, why she'd never reached out herself. They brushed that aside, saying this wasn't how family behaved, that forgiveness should come before apologies. I told them I disagreed. That was when they started talking about appearances, what relatives would say, how it would look if my sister wasn't there. My wedding, they argued, wasn't just about me, it was about the family. I listened exhausted and realized they weren't asking me to heal. They were asking me to perform. I stood my ground. A week later, my father called to tell me they wouldn't be attending the wedding after all. His voice was flat, rehearsed. He said Vicky was moving into a new place and had decided to host a housewarming party on the same day. Since I was excluding her, they would support her instead. I thanked him for letting me know and hung up before he could hear my voice break. Rob was furious. He paced our living room, muttering about priorities and cruelty, while I sat on the couch, feeling hollowed out. It was his idea to ask my grandparents. The suggestion felt obvious once he said it, so obvious, I wondered why I hadn't thought of it sooner. When I called them, I barely made it through the question before crying. They didn't hesitate. My grandmother told me it would be an honor. My grandfather said they would never abandon me the way my parents had. 2 days before the wedding, my father called again, this time angry. He demanded to know if it was true that my grandparents were walking me down the aisle. When I said yes, he exploded. He accused me of disrespect, of erasing him, of letting my grandparents replace him. He said declining the wedding invitation was supposed to teach me a lesson. That was when I understood everything. They hadn't withdrawn out of principle. They had expected me to beg. I told him calmly that I was done being taught lessons that only ever hurt me. He hung up on me. That night, I lay awake, wondering if I was doing the right thing. Old guilt clawed at me, whispering that maybe I was ungrateful, maybe I was cruel. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the years of silence, the blood in my mouth, the way they'd always chosen her. And I chose myself. The morning of my wedding arrived quietly, the way meaningful moments often do. Sunlight filtered through the curtains as my bridesmaids moved around the room, laughing, fixing each other's hair, pretending not to cry. I felt strangely calm. The decision had already been made long before this day. All that was left was to live inside it. When my grandparents took my arms and walked me down the aisle, something inside me settled. There was no bitterness in that moment, no desire to prove anything. Just gratitude. As I looked ahead and saw Rob waiting for me, smiling with that familiar mix of nerves and love, I knew I had chosen the right people to stand beside me. The ceremony was beautiful, intimate, ours. There were moments during the reception when the absence of my parents tugged at me, especially when Rob's parents stood to give a speech talking about pride and family and welcoming me as their daughter. I let myself feel the sadness without letting it swallow me. Grief doesn't disappear just because you've done the right thing. It just softens over time. The days after the wedding passed in a blur. Our honeymoon felt unreal, like a reward for enduring everything that came before it. I laughed more than I had in years. I woke up next to my husband and felt safe. For the first time, my life felt uncomplicated. I blocked my parents everywhere. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I didn't argue. I was tired of conversations that went nowhere. A month later, I found the email from Vicky. It was long, apologetic, careful. She admitted she'd been selfish, insecure, and cruel. She said she was proud of me. She asked me not to punish our parents for her mistakes. I read it twice. Part of me wanted to believe her. Another part recognized the timing for what it was. I didn't reply. Healing, I've learned, doesn't require closure from other people. Sometimes it just requires distance. I booked my first therapy appointment that same week, determined to finally unpack the things I'd carried alone for so long. I don't hate my parents. I still love them in the complicated way children love people who hurt them. But love doesn't mean access. It doesn't mean obligation. I have my husband, I have my friends, I have my grandparents. And for the first time in my life, that is enough.